August 14th, 1945. President Truman has an historic announcement to make.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
Across the United States, celebration was in order. Truman's announcement came as an enormous relief. Between March and July 1945, over 30,000 American GIs had died in combat in the Pacific. The war in Europe had been over for 3 months, but the same could not be said for the Far East, where anything could still happen. Although the Japanese government had been brought to its knees after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki several days earlier, the Empire of the Rising Sun was still in arms, and the Japanese archipelago remained a dangerous powder keg. President Truman named General Douglas MacArthur Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces and gave him 2 weeks to finalize and sign a peace treaty with Tokyo. Tokyo, the most bombarded city in the history of mankind. One of the last bombing raids on the Japanese capital had killed over 100,000 people. This is what most large Japanese cities look like, as General MacArthur prepared to land at the Atsugi Airport outside Tokyo on August 30th, 1945. It is 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Landing so near Tokyo was, to say the least, audacious. Japanese authorities had already warned MacArthur. 300,000 potentially hostile troops were still in the area, where MacArthur would be met by only 7,500 men. Such a dangerous landing was a veritable crapshoot. But MacArthur wanted to make an impression, so the press was invited to witness his confident, conquering arrival in the heart of hostile enemy territory. Despite his 65 years, MacArthur skillfully hid his jet lag. The style was casual but studied, his signature corncob pipe clearly visible. To Americans at home, the determined smile and aviator sunglasses gave the general the aura of a Hollywood movie star. MacArthur already had lots of experience dealing with the press. He also knew Japan well. He had visited several times when his father was governor of the Philippines. For this prelude to the eventual signing of a peace treaty, the setting and backgrounds were already carefully prepared. Armed soldiers were kept out of range of the cameras. The photos taken at Atsugi would inundate the Japanese and American press, and MacArthur's gamble had paid off royally. Everything had gone better than expected. But planners now had another thing to worry about. The trip MacArthur would have to take from the airport to his headquarters in Yokohama near Tokyo. Despite Japanese authorities' promise to line the 25-kilometer route with armed guards, MacArthur's entourage feared the worst as the general climbed into the waiting automobile. Among those who accompanied MacArthur, General Whitney remembered the moment.
This was the first time I had seen armed troops inside Japan. They lined both sides of the 20-kilometer route to Tokyo, their backs turned from MacArthur as a sign of respect. They were guarding the American Supreme Commander, exactly as they would have guarded the Emperor. I have to admit, I was worried watching them. I could not help wondering whether this was a sign of deference or whether they believed such heavy protection was really necessary.
The convoy stops only once, at a railroad crossing to allow a train to pass. In several kilometers, MacArthur would reach his hotel in Yokohama, where delegates from the Allied nations would gather before witnessing the Japanese surrender. The new Grand Hotel was one of the few buildings not destroyed by American bombs in the final months of the war. Among the personalities MacArthur wanted most to see were two generals who had been held by the Japanese as prisoners of war. He was surprised when the American General Jonathan Wainwright approached.
MacArthur later remembered. He was haggard and aged. His uniform hung in folds on his fleshless frame. He made a brave effort to smile as I took him in my arms, but when he tried to talk, his voice wouldn't come. For 3 years, he had imagined himself in disgrace for having surrendered at Corregidor.
Since the stinging American defeat in Corregidor in May 1942, the entire wealth and strategic importance of the Philippine Islands had fallen under Japanese control. In the 6 months since their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had amassed a resounding string of victories in the Pacific. Surrounded and without supplies and ammunition, General Wainwright had had no choice but surrender, and America had lost their Philippine protectorate.
MacArthur wrote that Wainwright believed he would never again be given an active command. This shocked me.
Wainwright had arrived at the Grand New Hotel with another of MacArthur's special guests, British General Percival. Like Wainwright, Percival had only recently been released from a Japanese POW camp. 3 years earlier, he had suffered the most bitter, humiliating defeat in the history of the British Empire, the encirclement and fall of Singapore, until February 15, 1942, considered an impenetrable stronghold. Percival surrendered with 85,000 soldiers who were driven to the coast and left stranded by 35,000 Japanese who had advanced through the jungle by foot, led by the impetuous Japanese general Yamashita. 30,000 Chinese were massacred in Singapore. Allied prisoners were transported to Siam to construct a railway line and a bridge over the River Kwai. United at the new Grand Hotel that evening, and amidst the ruins of Yokohama and under tight Allied security, Percival, Wainwright, and MacArthur awaited the arrival of the official delegations of the Allied nations. If everything went according to plan, the official Japanese surrender would take place the morning of September 2nd on the quarterdeck of the American battleship the USS Missouri, already anchored in Tokyo Bay. Saturday, September 1st, 1945. It's raining in Yokohama. The organizers of the ceremony hope for better weather the following morning. With time on their hands, the American cameramen adventure into the scorched and charred remains of the city, destroyed by the bombings. In the last 7 months of the war, more than 100,000 tons of bombs were dropped in incessant waves of American B-29 attacks on the largest Japanese cities. In those 7 months, 700,000 people were killed and 9 million left homeless. Yokohama and Tokyo had endured 9 major earthquakes over the last 3 centuries, but nothing even close to the loss of life and the devastation wrought in the final 7 months of the war in the Pacific. Ironically, after the last earthquake in 1923, the first rescue efforts had been carried out by the Americans, with whom the Japanese had long maintained close economic ties. The Japanese economy had been paralyzed for months, in every sector except those related to the war effort. Kitchen gardens were improvised amidst the ashes and the debris. This morning, the newspapers, called Shimbun, which had never stopped appearing, reported that the emperor was sending an official delegation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to assess the destruction and visit the hospitals. The two cities had been destroyed only 3 weeks earlier. The Asahi Shimbun consecrated a long piece on the dramatic food shortages, reporting that the 1945 harvest was the worst in almost 40 years. The Yomiuri Shimbun proposed that readers collect abandoned helmets, which the Ishikawa factories could then convert into pots and pans. Another article was devoted to the streetlights in Yokohama that the Americans had put back into service since their arrival 2 days earlier. Weather forecasts for the next day were promising. In Tokyo Bay that evening, Admiral Halsey, commander of the Third Fleet, whose enthusiastic character was already well known, organized a small reception for friends on board the battleship Missouri. Sunday, September 2nd, 1945, 7 a.m. 170 members of the film, radio, and photographic press install themselves to record the event, the much-awaited signing of the Japanese capitulation. In 3 hours, the entire world would officially be at peace. The Second World War would officially be over. The sky is gray, the weather warm, the battleship's quarterdeck specially equipped for the cameras to record the event under the best possible conditions. Although there are others, the American cameramen are both the most numerous and the best positioned. In the port of Yokohama, Generals Wainwright and Percival get on board the destroyer Buchanan, which would carry the Allied delegation to the battleship Missouri. The Canadian delegation arrives, led by the smiling Colonel Cosgrave. They are followed by the Soviet General Kuzma Nikolaevich Derevyanko. The nationalist Chinese delegation makes a more discreet entrance, composed of 5 members representing Chiang Kai-shek. Neighbors the night before at the New Grand Hotel, Australian General Sublimi and French General Jacques Leclerc seem happy to greet each other. And the Dutch delegation, led by Admiral Helfrich. The battleship Missouri is anchored in Tokyo Bay, an hour from the docks of Yokohama. With the American, British, and New Zealand delegations, General MacArthur would be surrounded by the largest number of high-ranking Allied commanders ever assembled. The tight security arrangements are therefore not surprising. An hour away from the Japanese shore and aboard an American warship. The Buchanan pulled up alongside the Missouri at 8:03 a.m. Preparations were almost complete. Everything had been well organized and spirits were high. General MacArthur was scheduled to arrive in 20 minutes, and the Japanese delegation soon afterwards. 2 copies of the agreement, one for the Allies and one for the Japanese, would be signed. The basis of the agreement, agreed to beforehand by the United States, Britain, China, and the USSR, stipulated that the Emperor and the Japanese civil and military authorities unconditionally accepted the disarmament and demobilization of almost 7 million Japanese troops, the liberation of all prisoners of war, the judgment of all war criminals, the new territorial boundaries of Japan, and the holding of new elections. The agreement also stipulated that during the occupation, Japanese authority would submit to that of the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, that is to say, to General Douglas MacArthur. Admiral Halsey on the left and Admiral Nimitz, commander of the Allied naval forces in the Pacific on the right, await the arrival of the Master of Ceremonies. 3 years earlier, the two had planned together the first bombing attack on Tokyo on Saturday, April 18, 1942. 16 bombers had been transported by aircraft carrier from the west coast of the United States to strike Japan before landing in the Soviet Union and China. Since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt had demanded retaliation. The action was intended as a morale booster to the Americans. Medals offered by the Japanese at the beginning of the century were symbolically attached to the bombs by Colonel James Doolittle himself, who led the attack on Tokyo. The runway was too short for the bomb-laden B-25s. The takeoffs were very risky and dangerous. The outcome of the mission was limited. Few victims, little damage. But the attack had a profound psychological impact on Japan. In China, the Japanese army captured and decapitated one of the mission crews, and thousands of Chinese civilians were massacred in Japanese reprisals. Beginning in 1944, the intensive Allied bombing of Japan was planned from the islands of Saipan and Tinian, some 2,000 kilometers from Tokyo. Each B-29 bomber would carry a 10-ton payload. From these islands were launched the attacks that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. The atomic bombs had been dropped less than a month earlier. Today, Admirals Nimitz and Halsey waited to welcome General MacArthur on board the USS Missouri.
MacArthur wrote, "Trying to recall my feelings at the moment we were to receive the surrender of the once mighty warlords of the Far East, I remember, first of all, a wish that my speech would rise to the level of my hopes, not only for all those who would listen, but for history."
Accompanied by Halsey and Nimitz, MacArthur retired to a cabin to await the arrival of the Japanese delegation and review the surrender agreements one final time. The Japanese delegation arrived discreetly in the port of Yokohama after a final meeting with the Imperial Council in Tokyo. For security reasons, the names of the two men designated to represent the Japanese government and military had been kept secret until the last moment. The first to prepare to board for the trip into Tokyo Bay was Foreign Affairs Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu. Those accompanying the minister included the diplomat Toshikazu Kase, who had once studied at an American university.
Nine of us accompanied the two official Japanese delegates, but there were no volunteers for this horrible mission. Foreign Minister Shigemitsu considered it painful but beneficial for Japan. The same could not be said for General Umesu, who was more than reluctant. The personal intervention of Emperor Hirohito was required before Umesu agreed to execute his duty. The trip to within sight of the Missouri, anchored some 20 kilometers from the shore, took over an hour. We were lowered into a motor launch. As we then approached the Missouri, our eyes were fixed upon the rows of sailors lining the rails of the battleship decks in their glittering uniforms of immaculate white, like a starry multitude. Minister Shigemitsu led the way up the gangplank, limping heavily on his wooden leg and cane. He'd lost his leg in a terrorist attack in Shanghai 15 years earlier.
That same morning, Kase had taken a note that he had helped compose from Shigemitsu to the Emperor.
This is a day of mourning and a disaster in the history of Japan. But we must consider more than its negative aspects. We must therefore make of this day of national mourning the first day of the birth of a new Japan. We 11 gathered into 3 short rows facing the Allied representatives, who stood behind a table covered in green cloth on which the documents of our capitulation were laid out. We were, I felt, subjected to the torture of a pillory. Millions of eyes were pointed at us, stinging like a sudden avalanche of flaming, barbed arrows. I felt them entering my flesh with sharp and poignant pain. Our situation was utterly humiliating. I forced myself to remain dignified and composed, but it was very difficult. Each minute seemed like an eternity. We waited like that, frozen in the public gaze, like penitent boys awaiting the dreaded schoolmaster.
I had received no instructions, MacArthur later wrote, as to what to say or what to do. I was on my own, standing on the quarterdeck with only God and my own conscience to guide me.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies have been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence are not for our discussion or debate.
The live radio broadcast was transmitted across the Pacific to the United States. MacArthur concluded,
"The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. As Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, I announce it my firm purpose, in the tradition of the countries I represent, to proceed in the discharge of my responsibilities with justice and tolerance, while taking all necessary dispositions to ensure that the terms of surrender are fully, promptly, and faithfully complied with. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Katsuo Okasaki, an attaché in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, spoke excellent English, and he presented the diplomatic credentials of the two Japanese representatives. The first would be his minister. Minister Shigemitsu had already had a long diplomatic career, with posts in Berlin, London, and the United States. He had always believed it a folly to have declared war on the United States and Great Britain. For months, he had clearly been in the Japanese camp of those arguing for peace at any price. It is exactly 9:04 in the morning. His signature and that of General Uemitsu meant their country accepted the unconditional terms of surrender, including the disarmament, occupation, and democratization of Japan. Japan would thus return to being the small country it had been 15 years earlier. It would lose the territories it had either conquered, repressed, or occupied. Japan's territory would cover only 1/4 of what the Japanese Empire had boasted in 1940. The second signer for Japan represented the military, 63-year-old General Uemitsu. In 1913, he'd been sent to Germany to pursue military studies. He later had been named one of the high commanders in northern China. Uemitsu's signature meant the war in the Pacific was over. For the Chinese present, it was the end of a war that had lasted 15 years. It had begun in 1931 with a Japanese invasion of Manchuria, a territory the size of France and rich in natural resources. In record time, the 3 northern Chinese provinces were invaded and occupied by the army of Guangdong, led by warmongering ultranationalists. Here, with the approval and financing of the army, Dr. Shiro Ishii created an immense center for the production of biological weapons, weapons which were ruthlessly tested on Chinese prisoners, the infamous Unit 731. Once conquered, these territories were quickly renamed Manchukuo, and Puyi, the formerly deposed Chinese emperor, was named the puppet emperor of Manchukuo. Manchukuo was the first stage of an extremely murderous Japanese war of conquest. It was a war conducted by armies that systematically took no prisoners, a war that lasted 10 years before blending into the Pacific theater of the Second World War. A war during which Chinese military and civilian casualties would number more than 11 million. In 1937, Shanghai had 3 million inhabitants. Their resistance lasted 7 weeks. Military officers like these argued that they had acted in the name of the Japanese emperor. But what exactly constituted imperial power? What were the decisions and responsibilities of Hirohito during these 15 years of war? Did the emperor, like Caesar, simply direct his thumb up or down? Did he ever even move it at all? The truth was quickly obscured, the state in which it remains today. Whatever the case, the Chinese war left terror-stricken memories. In only several weeks in Nankin, for example, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 Chinese men, women, and children were attacked, raped, tortured, and massacred. The superpowers manifested their consternation and shock, but Europe and America had their own more immediate urgencies to attend to. General Uemitsu affixed the second Japanese signature. In several months, he would be convicted of war crimes and sentenced to life in prison, where he died of cancer in 1949.
The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers will now sign on behalf of all the nations at war with Japan. Will General Wainwright and General Percival step forward and accompany me while I sign?
It was now time for General MacArthur to sign the Act of Surrender. MacArthur suddenly withdrew 5 pens dramatically from his pocket. What was MacArthur up to? Wondered most of those who watched. Halfway through the first signature, he stopped, turned, and offered the pen to General Wainwright. He finished his signature with the second pen, which he gave to British General Percival. As for the other pens, one was destined for the United States Military Academy at West Point, from where he graduated, and another for the National Archives. He would save the 5th, bright red pen, for his wife Jean, who was in Manila with their son. It was now Admiral Chester Nimitz's turn. He, who since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had commanded American naval forces in the Pacific, would sign as the American representative. Nimitz had firmly made it known to all the invited guests on the USS Missouri that neither disrespectful language nor any discourteous remark about or to the conquered Japanese would be tolerated. Admiral Nimitz was well known to a member of the Japanese delegation, Imperial Naval Strategist Admiral Tomioka, who had kept a photo of Nimitz on his desk for several years in recognition of the man he considered his personal adversary. Admiral Tomioka had been one of the masterminds of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the lethal and lightning assault launched from Japanese aircraft carriers on Sunday, December 7, 1941. Why had Japan declared war on the United States? Washington had been concerned with the progression of Japanese conquests in the Pacific for well over a year, and had canceled commercial relations with Tokyo and declared an embargo on all iron and oil shipments to Japan. Japanese credits had been blocked in the United States, Great Britain, and in all the Dutch East Indies, the future Indonesia. The attack on Pearl Harbor followed the breakdown in diplomatic negotiations, and as such was hardly a surprise. But the bombing attack had resulted in 2,345 American deaths. In the last row of the Japanese delegation stood Vice Admiral Ishiro Yokoyama, who recognized a tall American with whom he had been friendly before the attack on Pearl Harbor.
The presence of Admiral Turner filled me with shame. He telephoned my office several days later and told me he had deliberately not looked in my direction, knowing that any visual contact would be extremely embarrassing for me. I was extremely grateful. We saw each other again in 1955 when I visited the United States.
General Su Young-chang signs for the Chinese nationalists, whose wish to participate in the occupation and administration of Japan had been heard but rejected. In China, the nationalists and the communists are each racing to recuperate the territories abandoned by the Japanese. Admiral Fraser signs for Great Britain. Originally against a military occupation of Japan, Prime Minister Winston Churchill later changed his mind and agreed to participate. Following Great Britain, the signature of the Soviet Union's representative was much anticipated. Having entered the war against Japan only a few weeks earlier, the Soviets had already pounced on Manchuria. In northern Japan, they had taken over the entire island of Sakuril. And on this day of signing the Japanese surrender, they would help themselves to the half-moon-shaped chain of Kuril Islands. Stalin's armies were at Japan's door. Tomorrow, the energetic General Derevyanko would attempt to convince MacArthur to share the Japanese occupation.
The representative of Australia will now sign.
General Blamey was among the last to sign. In 1942, only 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese threatened to invade Australia. The city Darwin was bombed, and the evacuation of the northern Australian continent had been seriously considered.
The representative of Canada will now sign.
Whether because of the tension accompanying the occasion or something MacArthur whispered in his ear, Colonel Cosgrave was distracted as he prepared to sign the second document, the copy to be kept by the Japanese. He signed on the line destined for the following French signature, leaving the Canadian space blank.
The representative of France will now sign.
France is represented by General Jacques Leclerc. En route to Indochina, where France's post-war return to its former colonies promised to be hazardous, and where in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh would today take advantage of Japan's collapse to proclaim Vietnam's independence, Leclerc signed the document, apparently overlooking the error made by his Canadian counterpart.
The representative of Netherlands will now sign.
The Dutch colonies in Indonesia, with their enormous iron and oil reserves, had been seized by the Japanese in 1942. Admiral Helfrich has trouble finding where he should now sign the second document for the Japanese. The solution proposed by MacArthur does not totally satisfy the admiral.
Representative of New Zealand will now sign.
The last signer would be New Zealand Vice Marshal Isitt. In a few moments, when both documents were signed, the Second World War would officially be over. With the only space remaining on the second document being in the margins, Isitt decides to follow the Master of Ceremonies' directions and goes ahead and signs.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.
Despite their no longer being considered the enemy, the prearranged protocol called for the Japanese delegation to depart the ceremony with neither salute nor other recognition. The Allied signers were to retire to Admiral Halsey's cabin to celebrate. All follow MacArthur, with the exception of the Dutch Admiral Helfrich, who signals the problem with the second document as diplomat Okazaki comes forward to receive the Japanese copy of the surrender. Helfrich can be seen on the left, showing that his signature is not above his name. Because of the error committed by the Canadian, 4 signatures are out of place. What then is the value of such a document? Okazaki seems stunned. Why the sudden feeling of chaos? How did the inkwell spill that he puts back into place? The raised voices of those suddenly approaching the table. Chief of Staff General Sutherland is unsure of what to do. Alerted to the problem, MacArthur emerges from the cabin to take a look, but decides not to get involved. Meanwhile, General Sutherland attempts to convince Okazaki to accept the copy intended for the Imperial Council as signed.
I then returned to Minister Shigemitsu to see if this error was acceptable or not. He responded that the Imperial Council would refuse the document as is. I therefore demanded of General Sutherland that the document be re-signed by MacArthur and the other official delegates. He responded that he would not call them back. They had left to make a toast and celebrate, and that I could correct the mistakes myself. I then insisted that the corrections be made by General MacArthur, and if not, by himself as Chief of Staff. This he accepted to do.
The first error was committed by Canadian Colonel Cosgrave, who signed in the space intended for French General Leclerc. That error resulted in all the final 4 signatures being written out of place. With great care, General Sutherland crosses out the typewritten text and prints out by hand the appropriate names corresponding to the signatures.
When I told him he should then initial each correction, he did so. Chief of Staff General Sutherland responded simply to our request. But if our roles had been reversed, I'm sure we would have been very arrogant and refused any such request. In any event, this is how the signing of the documents came to an end. It was 9:30.
The flyover of several hundred American warplanes had been intended to close the ceremony. But Sutherland's corrections on the Japanese copy of the capitulation agreement took some time, a good deal of time. The planes passed over the USS Missouri while the 11 members of the Japanese delegation were still on board. Their eventual departure would be marked by general indifference, because the show was elsewhere. After flying over Tokyo Bay, the squadrons headed for the capital to make a demonstration of impressive force to the Japanese population. In case of a feared attack on the Missouri during the ceremony, these planes carried with them 8,000 tons of bombs. Since the first bombardment of Tokyo in 1942, American pilots had been formally ordered to spare the Imperial Palace. It can be seen in the distance through the cockpit windows. The Emperor followed the proceedings on the radio. He awaited the report of the official delegation. Although his approval was no longer required, it would facilitate relations between the occupiers and the occupied. The Allied delegations returned to port. Most would leave Japan within 24 hours. General Derivienko would stay behind, convinced he could browbeat MacArthur into splitting occupational powers with the Soviets. In vain. Since the dropping of the atomic bombs, power was in American hands, and all decisions would be MacArthur's, and MacArthur's alone. MacArthur was convinced that a successful American occupation depended on maintaining the Japanese imperial institutions. The Allies agreed. MacArthur made his official entrance into the Japanese capital on the morning of September 8th.
I did not visit Tokyo for the first time until 6 days after the surrender ceremonies, MacArthur wrote. It was 22 miles from the new Grand Hotel in Yokohama to the American Embassy, which was to be my home throughout the occupation. I had to rebuild a country that had been almost completely destroyed by the war. It was clear that the experiment in Japan must go far beyond the primary purpose of the Allies, the destruction of Japan's ability to wage another war and the punishment of war criminals. Japan became the world's great experiment in the liberation of a people from a totalitarian regime and the liberalization of a government from within.
Washington would send a 430,000-man occupation force. The American occupation was carefully planned. Indeed, possible scenarios had been studied in Washington for the last 3 years. All possible scenarios, from a moderate intervention to the simple and total abolition of the Japanese state. Yet in the end, eliminating the Japanese administration was inconceivable. Where could 500,000 Japanese-speaking government officials and administrators be found elsewhere? The emperor and the Japanese state apparatus would remain in place. America would indirectly govern the country. The bombing and embargo had been very effective, but Japan was now approaching a state of famine. One of MacArthur's first measures concerned the 1 million daily meals to be served to the occupying troops. They would be fed exclusively with imported food. In Tokyo and throughout the country, two realities existed at first in a state of empty suspension: the reality of 15 years of war and the announced arrival of peace. The press reported the ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in great detail. Conditions and stipulations of the Japanese surrender were also clarified. The newspapers quickly reported that the schools would reopen after being closed for the last 6 months. But one of the most striking articles sought to make the population feel guilty, to lay the greatest responsibility for the defeat on their shoulders. Morality, wrote its author, died in the same moment the people should have united to confront the common enemy in a conflict without pity. But everyone, he continued, thought only of themselves and sought only to protect themselves with selfish egotism. It is true that in the final months of the war, absenteeism had reached crisis proportions in every sector of the Japanese economy. The black market thrived throughout the country. Moreover, men and women dared send messages of anger and insult to government officials, and even to the emperor. The day the war ended, the feeling of relief was immense. For 15 years, Japanese society had been bled, crushed, ravaged. The standard of living in Tokyo had dropped to a quarter of what it had been before the war. 3 million people had died. 9 million now lived without shelter. And over 6 million would be repatriated from the former imperial colonies. The Japan inherited by the American occupational forces was on the brink of utter chaos.